We are honored to continue what's been a series of fascinating conversations with some really important individuals. And for our next panel, we're honored to have Ambassador Lana Nusseibeh, who has served as the United Arab Emirates representative at the United Nations since 2013. Ambassador Nusseibeh was also appointed as the non-resident ambassador of the UAE to Grenada in November 2017. Previously, she served in several capacities within the UAE's foreign ministry, including as the UAE's co-special envoy to Afghanistan and Pakistan. Perhaps most interesting to, or one of the more interesting aspects of Ambassador Nusseibeh's bio is that she holds a master's degree in Israeli and Jewish diaspora studies from the University of London, and we will definitely be getting into that. Rabbi Yehuda Sarna serves as the university chaplain and the executive director at the Bronfman Center for Jewish Student Life at NYU. NYU opened a campus in Abu Dhabi in 2008, and Rabbi Sarna has spent the last decade plus making several trips back and forth, and last year was named the Chief Rabbi of the United Arab Emirates, which Haim Saban alluded to in the prior panel. And it reminded me that David Brooks used to joke that being the conservative columnist at the New York Times was like being the chief rabbi of Saudi Arabia. And of course, the joke is maybe not what it once was. And again, we're honored to have Rabbi Sarna with us. Ambassador Nusseibeh, I thought if we could start with you. One thing I left out of the bio, which I'm hoping you can share with our audience, is that the Nusseibeh family is a legendary family in Jerusalem. And would love to hear from you what it was like to grow up in that family, and specifically what you could share about the family's special responsibility in the Old City that carries through to this day.
Thank you, Max, for hosting both myself and my good friend, Rabbi Sarna, who's become a colleague and actually an ally at the United Nations, particularly in terms of bringing into the United Nations the realization of what these stories, our backgrounds, how the interfaith connections in our region really turns around who we are today. And this idea of coming together, of being stronger, united, is something that defines certainly my career and my family history, and I think Rabbi Sarna's personal journey as well, which he shared with some colleagues of mine in the Organization of Islamic Cooperation at an interfaith iftar that he attended after he'd been appointed as Chief Rabbi of the UAE, which is an honor for us. But I think what it demonstrated to colleagues at the UN is that this is what is at stake in our work every day in multilateral diplomacy and these agreements that we sign, that ultimately they are about the people-to-people connection. They are about whether families thrive and have a chance in life to, follow their opportunities, educate their children, provide for them, or whether they are designated to live lives in conflict and instability. And thank you, Rabbi, for all that you do in that work. I'd like to start with that thanks to you. You're a good friend to the UAE. And I look forward to our continued cooperation. My personal story is perhaps one that is like others, Palestinians, diaspora communities around the world. My father went to the UAE in '67 after graduating from university in England. And of course, there was no possibility of returning to his home where he had grown up in Jerusalem. And he was fortunate to come to a country that was already in those early days, before the formation of the United Arab Emirates, looking for bright, dedicated, ambitious, creative people to contribute to the society and the vision that was being built by the leadership there. And I'd like to start with that. So our story in many ways as a family, yes, goes back centuries to Jerusalem and to the key to the Holy Sepulchre that we are the custodian of in Jerusalem, which was an honor awarded to a Muslim family in order to keep the peace, if you like, amongst Christian families at that time. But importantly to us, as I grew up in Abu Dhabi, that story to me just symbolized the strength of our unity, the strength of the interfaith community, the strength of what happens in human society when we focus on the opportunities for change and hope, rather than the nihilistic agendas that are being presented to us as options for our region. And so growing up in Abu Dhabi, that was really the story I saw around me every day. I saw that my family had been given the chance to become part of another nation and to serve that nation. My father served in government as the advisor and translator to His Highness the late president, and continues his role in government today as a cabinet minister. I saw that I was able to contribute in my own way to our diplomatic service. I saw that I grew up surrounded by another 190 or so different nationalities, all living and working side by side in the UAE, in an amazing fabric, an amazing tapestry of different peoples and cultures and religions. We attended Christmas services. I went with friends to their temple services, to the Hindu temples in the UAE. And that was very much my upbringing before I went to the UK. And so I think it's just reflective of the DNA of the UAE as we developed, that this peace accord happened in the way that it happened, organically, which is often the best way, which is that as a country, we are looking to the future. We're looking to provide opportunity and hope, not only to our youth in the UAE, but to the youth around the region. As Dina mentioned in the first panel, the high percentage of whom are under the age of 30, 80% was the number she mentioned. And I think that this is part and parcel of what the UAE success story has been. It has been around the empowerment of women. It has been around the empowerment of youth. It has been around stories like inviting the Pope for the first time to visit the Arabian Peninsula last year in a historic visit where a document for human fraternity was signed. And it's certainly been in the creation and the building, for example, of the Abrahamic Family House in Abu Dhabi that will house a mosque and a synagogue and a church, all on the same sacred ground. I don't find it surprising that I spent Yom Kippur yesterday speaking to a synagogue in Rai. I don't find it surprising that Rabbi Sarna and I are often planning events together at the UN. I think that's part and parcel of the fabric of the society that I come from in the UAE and represent every day at the UN. And of course, it ties in with the heritage and the history that I've known from my family background as well.
Excellent. We're going to come back to your master's degree. Rabbi Sarna, how does a New York rabbi born in Montreal become the chief rabbi of the United Arab Emirates? What's the backstory that you can share with our audience?
Well, first of all, I just wanted to say it's always a pleasure to be on a panel with you, Ambassador Nusseibeh. I mean, I was so touched the first time that you invited me to speak at the UN. I was really blown away by the sense of trust and vision and courage, which your office always exhibits and which you personally hold up as a model really for everyone. So I'm just so grateful for our friendship and look forward to the many, many years to come. For me, the story is really rooted in confronting Islamophobia here in the United States, in the shadow, the long shadow of 9/11. When I, working at New York University since 2002, the year after 9/11 occurred, and coming to terms with the fact that the ways that Muslim students were being in some ways targeted, in many ways stereotyped, and had to chart for themselves a pathway in American society, which the truth is was a double burden in many ways. I mean, on the one hand, they were tasked with, just like any young person, trying to establish their careers, but on the other hand, trying to navigate through a stereotype which, to no fault of their own, was becoming entrenched in many segments of American society. And I found myself being brought into the conversation. Growing up, I had never really met a Muslim person before, let alone befriend them. But I became so inspired by the courage and bravery of the NYU students, Muslim students. And then when NYU and Abu Dhabi reached an agreement, I was very touched when I received the invitation from President John Sexton to come to Abu Dhabi. Truth is, I'd never heard of it before. I could not have pointed to it on a map. I knew nothing of its history or heritage. And from that first moment when I landed in the airport in Abu Dhabi and was just treated with, like everyone else, treated with such a sense of welcoming and hospitality, what it almost immediately did is it began pulling apart my own stereotypes, even though I had been the one working to combat Islamophobia, but nevertheless, there were still remnants which I had to come to terms with on my own. I remember being that first trip, I was with the Imam at NYU, Khalid Latif, and we went grocery shopping for some things we wanted to pick up. And I was perusing the cheese aisle and looking for cream cheese that perhaps would have a kosher certification on it. And at one point he said, "Oh, excuse me for a second, let me run to another aisle." And I said, "Of course," and then realized that I was all alone in an Arab country. And I can't even describe to you, it sounds silly at this point to say, but the surge of fear that overcame me, I was almost certain that I was going to become the victim of an attack in the cheese aisle of Carrefour, a French grocery chain. And I let that surge of fear pass, and then I realized the extent to just how absurd it was, but at the same time, how we all, in one way or another, are gripped. We are in the grips of the stereotypes that we've either inherited from parents, from friends, from media. It's just a part of how we're hardwired. And so it was that very fascination of that fear, the desire to continue combating the stereotypes of others and its manifestations in the United States, but also in a very real way, coming to terms with my own Arabophobia. And I think that's one of the points of fascination that kept bringing me back year after year when I'd come with a crew from New York University in New York to interview students who were coming from all over the world to gain admission at NYU Abu Dhabi. In time, I came to know a small group of Jews, both in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, who were looking to form a community. 2015, there were regular Shabbat services every week. And I began to advise them, sometimes virtually and then in person when I would come, on some key elements on how to navigate this path, establishing the first new Jewish community on the Arabian Peninsula, perhaps in centuries, and with a very, very willing and hospitable government and government infrastructure. I think there was no point at which people felt like they were on unwelcome territory. And at the same time, we're treading carefully. We're weighing different social costs with their own friends, actually, particularly with Europeans, and for their kids, just wanting their kids to be fully integrated into the schools where they were. And in 2019, again, the community asked me if I would serve as Chief Rabbi. And really the way the role has developed, it's been really to exist at the nexus between three different elements. One, of course, is the Jewish community, to represent it, to nurture it, to enable it to grow, to raise up its voices. The second is the UAE authorities, and to really help participate in the broader mission of the UAE in spreading tolerance throughout the region and beyond. And then thirdly, global Jewish organizations, to enable the local Jewish community in the UAE to get on the grid. And what I've found is that, and I've worked with and gotten to know many different leaders from all different aspects of society, elements of society in the United States and beyond. And I have to say, if there was a group of inspiring, visionary leaders coming out of any country, it's the UAE. I think we can't just talk about national leadership or regional leadership. Really what we're looking at, and Ambassador Nusseibeh is a big part of it. What we're looking at is a group of people who've been raised within a tradition, which is very future-oriented, bold, courageous, open, wanting to attract the best talent in the world to further this vision. And that's one of the reasons why part of what I'm trying to do is to enable these voices to come to the Jewish community in the United States and beyond. Just this past weekend, we had the Minister of Youth Affairs, Her Excellency Shama Al-Mazroui, speak on a Friday afternoon service. And there was a journalist from from the Times of Israel who was on the call, and she said, that was an extraordinary, those were extraordinary words. Could we put that up? And sure enough, already today, it just went up. There's over 1,000 shares, and Her Excellency's words are getting out there.
Thank you, Rabbi Sarna. I know we're eager to learn more about the state of the Jewish community in the UAE today. One thing I'll note for the audience is feel free to pop your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. Ambassador Nusseibeh, you mentioned about your family's history and heritage. And again, I would love if you could share what led you to pursue the master's degree in Israeli and Jewish diaspora studies that you did, and maybe some of the things that you learned about the Jewish community and Israel, and how you've seen those come into play, certainly in the last few months.
Well, there was no thinking about my future career prospects. I promise you, when I chose that degree, like many people who graduate from their first degree, they spend a lot of time thinking about how they avoid the job market for as long as possible by continuing with further study. And I wanted to get deeper into the Middle East. I wanted to join a Middle Eastern program. And I thought about it at the time, and I realized that joining a Middle Eastern program at any of the academic institutions in the UK, I graduated from my first degree from there as well, would have essentially led me to the dinner conversations I grew up with around the family dinner table. And I decided to challenge myself and look at the Middle East from a wider picture, and a picture that, perhaps was more taboo at the time to acknowledge, but a picture that very much included Israel as part of that geography and what that meant historically and what that means today and what that means in the future. And I think that was the thinking behind applying for that degree. And again, it was a country, and my parents are an example of that country, but my parents thought the degree sounded interesting and I should go ahead and do it. And so I joined the Israeli and Jewish Diaspora Studies program for a second master's in London. And it was led by an incredible professor, Dr. Colin Schindler, who had founded the department against a lot of resistance in London at the time. There were some activist movements against the idea of establishing such a department. And, I found myself unusually in a class of people that I probably wouldn't have found myself amongst as peers in any other program, certainly not in a Middle Eastern program. And I think that was in itself quite eye-opening. I also studied Hebrew for a year, and I think frustrated a few of my Jewish peers who found the Hebrew language, if they hadn't been exposed to it, quite difficult. Whereas for Arab-speaking people, it's similar in terms of Semitic roots and sounds, etc. And I also studied the history of Zionism and the movement. My professor was an expert on Jabotinsky. I enjoyed delving into that, and I got into a lot of very academic debates with him about the founding theology, if you like, of Israel, but also learned a little bit about Judaism in that period. And to be honest, I think that's, again, an expression of how the UAE looks at our region, which is with openness. I think the UAE is open to learning about the different cultures and religions that come to the UAE and reside, but also that are around us in the region. And we feel very strongly in the preservation of that heritage and in its richness. And I certainly picked that up in my time spent on that program. And then, of course, afterwards, my family would say, well, what are you going to do with that degree now? And I said, I have no idea. And luckily that led me to a career eventually in government service. But it was an eye-opening experience and a program of study that I really enjoyed.
Well, quite the foresight, certainly looking back today. And you mentioned the movement against the university program that you were a part of. And obviously you've been at the United Nations since 2013, and it's an environment that typically has not been quite friendly to Israel. And I'm curious if you've, from your perch, how you've seen that either evolve or what you learned from when you entered the UN 7 years ago to today.
So I think that we've put this position on the record many times. Ambassador Artebo also mentioned it earlier. We believe, and we continue to believe, that we can have a relationship with Israel, but at the same time that we are firmly committed to the two-state solution, and that eventually the Palestinians and the Israelis need to negotiate the contours of that peace agreement themselves. And this is not it. This is not a Middle East peace as such. It is a historic breakthrough. It is a diplomatic breakthrough. And it's a sign of optimism and hope in a really troubled region, that things can be different if we change the dynamic and we change the script and approach it in a different way. I think at the UN, it's a place where a lot of these global problems can be addressed by the international community in an equal and egalitarian way, where each country has a voice at the table. And I think that's the importance of the UN system today. I know that there are a lot of critics of the UN who see it as outdated or not fit for purpose for the challenges that we face today internationally, most recently, for example, in the response to COVID-19. And we all have to keep reminding ourselves that the UN was founded for a reason after World War II in 1945 in order to prevent the scourge of war, in order to prevent humanity falling into such an atrocious state of being again, where the things that happened in that war could happen. And I think it's important to remember that. And sometimes you worry that as time passes and the historical narrative gets weaker, the international community will forget why we all came together and created that building and that place where people could come together and discuss these issues before lives were ruined forever. So we do feel as a country that the UN has that importance in global peace and security. And His Highness Sheikh Abdullah, our foreign minister, announced today that we would be seeking election to the UN Security Council, the highest body for peace and security. The vote will happen in June next year. And I think it's an opportunity for us to demonstrate everything that we have been discussing here today about our model, our perspective for the region, a perspective of openness, tolerance, integration, working to find regional solutions. And that's also going to be the approach I think we will have, having widened the tent and having that communication channel directly with Israel. I think that is going to be eventually a political channel that is helpful in solving what has been an intractable conflict, which has been a very difficult conflict between the Arab world and the Israelis. One of the comments that struck me in my discussion with the synagogue yesterday, the congregation, was a question from the participants. It was a young boy who was the son of the rabbi of the congregation. And he said, we grew up, much to Rabbi Sarna's earlier story, we grew up thinking that all the Arabs hated us and they just can't stand us and they want to drive us into the sea. And that's what we grew up learning. And how do we know this is different? And I remember thinking yesterday, you know, there's so much work that needs to be done in terms of our education, in terms of our curriculum, in terms of how we approach each other, to unlearn that, to understand there aren't monolithic groups such as the Arabs or the people, you know, the Jewish people or the State of Israel. There are different sections of opinion, there's different views. That's what makes a country exciting and interesting and dynamic, and that your role is to persuade as many people as possible in your public, and Ambassador Yusuf was talking about public constituencies earlier, your role is to persuade as many as possible that the peace dividend outweighs a state of conflict, that the peace dividend, if countries can live in harmony, can share the resources, can share borders, and cooperate on security and food security, water security, exploration of space, artificial intelligence, empowering women and youth, medical technology in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. If we can collaborate on all of these things, then the human race is better for it, and certainly our region is better for it. So the UN is a challenging environment in the sense that this issue is prominent there, the Palestinian-Israeli issue, but there are a number of other issues that we are also addressing that are important. And I think that we're hoping that eventually our direct relationship with Israel will have a positive impact in the restart of negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis, because they're the only people who can decide how that story ends. And we hope it ends with Israel's full integration, with a two-state solution, with everybody living peacefully side by side. That's our hope. But at the same time, we're going to have our communications channel with Israel and explore our cooperation in all of these fields that I mentioned. And I think that's the space that we're now in at the United Nations.
So I want to pick up on something that you mentioned, the perspective of tolerance in the United Arab Emirates. I had the privilege of visiting the UAE last year with Rabbi Sarna, and it was during the kind of year of tolerance. And so something I'm hoping both the ambassador and the rabbi can share with our audience. We're getting a lot of questions along these lines, but just, for the standard American or American Jew, if you could paint a picture of what the Jewish community in the United Arab Emirates looks like today. We're getting a number of questions, Rabbi, about what your role looks like and kind of the life cycle events. But then the follow up to that is, obviously it's a remarkable community, and it's been growing the last number of years. I think there's a question of could this be a model? Is this a model for kind of larger Muslim Jewish ties? Rabbi, why don't you take the first shot?
Sure. How can I put this? Jews who are living in the UAE came for the most part because they feel safe there and for economic opportunity. Whether they're coming from Europe or South Africa or the United States or Canada or Syria or Lebanon or Tunisia or France, they've been coming from all over, basically because with rising anti-Semitism in several countries and with economies in certain countries not being as strong, they felt like there was opportunity. Initially, none of them moved to the UAE to become a part of history. And still somehow history has chosen them to build a community, which is certainly historic in nature. The term that the people in the community started using is to serve as a lighthouse community, not that they have an exclusive claim to the light, but at least that as a metaphor that the kind of community that we're trying to build is not one which is insular, but instead one which is open and engaging with other lighthouse communities around it. And it's not at this point, it's not lost on anyone who is a member that there's more to showing up than just showing up. There are more people now who are comfortable being open and sharing their identity with others. But this has given the community a renewed sense of purpose and mission. And look, and that's the work. I can't really comment on the life cycle question unless someone's looking for a bar mitzvah to be done or something. We could talk about dates, but I would say that the main point of negotiation I had about my role with the community is that I insisted that it really be a volunteer role. I didn't want to have any kind of debt, any financial debt to anybody, the community, or anybody else. I want it to be clear to everybody that I'm doing this for the simple reason that I really, really believe in it. That building this Jewish community in the UAE is it's in order for it to happen, many people on many different sides had to exhibit courage. And it's just a privilege for me to be a part of that group and play some small role.
Ambassador Nusseibeh, a number of people have commented. They obviously every day there's different headlines. Today's headline is about a UAE football club getting an Israeli player. One of the headlines that caught a lot of people's attention was kind of the mandate, I believe it was in Abu Dhabi, about hotels needing to provide kosher food. And, a few people have remarked, when the Emiratis decide to do something, there's no hesitation. They're kind of all in. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit about, that, if that is indeed the case and kind of, what people can expect, when they come to visit the United Arab Emirates, hopefully soon.
Well, it's a big question. And I think a lot of these details are being ironed out as we speak, but it is true that a company called Kosher Arabia, I believe, has already launched to supply kosher food to the airlines and to the hotel industry. And I think, you know, on the people-to-people level, everyone is looking for the opportunities for growth. We understand that it's a challenging period economically post-COVID-19. We understand we have a massive youth demographic. We need to provide opportunities for that youth demographic around our region. And we're looking at ways to innovate startups, AI, as I mentioned, and all these other industries. I think they're all being explored at the moment. I have a very good friend who's getting a lot of calls similar to the ones described in the earlier panel from Israelis saying, do you think they'll be interested in this? Do you think they'll be interested in that? And the one that made me laugh the most is, you know, I have an all-women basketball team. Do you think they'd be interested in that? And if they wouldn't, I can find an all-male basketball team and bring them over. And I think that this is something that, you know, there's going to be a lot of these anecdotal stories, but I think what it speaks to is that this is not like a peace agreement where there was a lot of bad blood between the populations. This is not about ending conflict. This was not about border issues or a cold peace. This is a very warm peace. And I think we've seen that in the social media space. If I look at the social media space around the world, it's been incredibly warm. It's been about curiosity. It's been about openness. It's been about trying to understand each other better, being eager to learn language, being eager to learn about religious background, how to be culturally sensitive towards each other, the do's and don'ts, the etiquette of making friends, and so forth. And I think that's going to be the building blocks of the relationship at the beginning, along with the business ties and the sort of civil aviation agreements that bring the people back and forth, et cetera, and bring tourists to us. I think, you know, building on that, the relationship will go to strength, from strength to strength, if we all commit ourselves to working to it. And I do want to say that really struck me at the White House lawn, sitting next to old timers who'd been at previous signing ceremonies there and watching those go wrong. And what struck me is that while we're witnessing a moment and an opportunity, we're also taking on a responsibility, all of us who witnessed that, who supported that, who thought it was the right step for the region. And I think that responsibility is to make this work, to realize this vision for peace in our region. And it can be in your own small way that you contribute to that. It can be these panels. It can be in sharing, you know, that what UAE citizens feel and what the residents feel towards this agreement. It can be sharing, you know, hopes and fears from other communities about coming to the UAE. And then it can be on the bigger things and the bigger issues. But I think if we don't all commit to that responsibility in the witnessing of that ceremony, it's going to be a difficult pathway ahead, and there's going to be bumps on the road because there are going to be disagreements. There are going to be moments of tension in the region. And we have to work our way through those by building confidence in each other and building trust. So I think that's the starting point I'd like to stress on in terms of what I felt witnessing that signing ceremony. I think in terms of the Jewish community in the UAE, as Rabbi Sarna has said, it's nascent, but it's also historic. It's slowly come to the fore. It's becoming more confident, if you like, in its place in our country. And I think that's very important to us, because it's very important to us that everybody who lives and resides in the UAE feels a part of that community, feels a part of that society. And on a different discussion, when talking about this with Ross Creel, who has led the Jewish community there for a number of years quietly, and occasionally we'd have phone calls about how to get past customs barriers on bringing in Torah scrolls, or how to do this or how to do that. And suddenly we're moving to conversations like the ones we're having today. And it's just been so quick, the pace, where he's looking at a panel and saying that before he felt, as Rabbi Sarna described, that he was a person of the Jewish faith who had moved to the UAE to pursue an economic opportunity, like many around him in the temple where they meet and worship in Dubai, to suddenly feeling, and he said these words and it really struck me, that we are the Jewish community of the UAE. And that's who we're going to be known as henceforth, and we're comfortable saying that. And for me, that was really a turning point and a moment of incredible pride that we had been able to bring that sense of openness to our country organically over the years.
Thank you, Ambassador. We are almost out of time, so we have one last question. The United Arab Emirates, similar to Israel, is actually a young country, and I believe the UAE is celebrating its 50th anniversary later this year. And so I'll just ask each of you for a prediction, hopefully a hopeful prediction, of what the UAE, its Jewish community, relations between Muslims and Jews will look like, pick 10, 15, 25, or 50 years from now. Ambassador, you want to start?
I'll let Rabbi start with that one because
Okay.
of that. They also inappropriate things at this point.
I think that I think what we're looking at is really a tipping point in Muslim-Jewish relations worldwide. I believe that the UAE's decision to recognize Israel and to engage in this accord made it such that now I believe it's a majority of Islamic countries or Muslim majority countries have relations with Israel, with the UAE making that step. And I think that signifies something very important on a global level about the relationship between Jews and Muslims, and not to be overlooked. Not that it's impossible for Jews and Muslims to have relations without Israel in the picture, but I do think that going from the 27 to 29 out of the 57 states, I think is very symbolic. What I would say is that judging from the energy on the ground, when I was just there for the Jewish New Year, for Rosh Hashanah, and meeting people actually who had just moved within the past week or two to the UAE, some from Israel, some from other places, and who were celebrating the New Year with us, there is a tremendous enthusiasm, curiosity, energy, excitement about building out not the political dimensions of the accord, but building out everything else that it's giving a platform to. It would not surprise me if in a number of years we're not looking at 1,000 Jews in the UAE, but we're looking at something closer to 10,000, and we'd be looking at hundreds of thousands of Israeli and Jewish tourists a year. And I think the UAE is going to take its place as a major hub of Jewish life on the map. I think it's going to become a common destination. It's going to become a common place for people to stop over on their way to other places, as it is for actually so many people around the world. And I think one unforeseen consequence of this is that a deeper engagement between Israelis and Emiratis will actually challenge, for many Israelis, will challenge their notions of what does it mean to be Arab, of Arab identity. And I think that will very much have a bit of a moderating effect on the Israeli political spectrum. I've written, my first reaction to the accord was that the reality now is that there's tens of thousands of American Jewish teens who go to Israel on an identity trip. And there's tens of thousands of Israeli teens who actually go to Poland every year on an identity trip. And my suggestion is that really both communities should be sending tens of thousands of teens to the UAE every year. That deeper engagement with the Arab world is essential, and the UAE is a portal to it. The last thing I'll just say is, as Lana is preparing her prophecy, is that when I was on the White House lawn, I chose to wear my talit, my prayer shawl, and it wasn't so much that I was aware of other people around me, but I knew that for many people, this day was a day commemorating a political event. But to me, the Abraham Accord is liturgy. To me, it was a day of prayer. And I fasted that day until the accord was signed. And I felt myself being very deep in prayer, and I wore my prayer shawl as a reminder to it. And I think that for anybody who's listening, who's not a political person, but who is in either education, spiritual leadership, civic leadership, or in business of any different kind, you have to remember that here the political leaders have done their job. They've They've taken the risks, they've acted boldly, and now it's up to the rest of us to really build the peace.
I couldn't agree more with that prophecy. That's the vision I hope is the one that is realized with all of our hard work. I was speaking to the director of our diplomatic academy a couple of days ago, and he told me that he'd just started Hebrew language training for our diplomats in our academy. That's all happened in the space of 2 weeks. So yes, we do move quickly in the UAE. The Israelis also move very quickly. We're two vibrant, young, ambitious economies and societies that want to see a better future in our region. I think if this had happened 20 years ago, you'd have seen a very different reaction internationally and even in the Arab world, but you haven't seen that reaction today. You've seen widespread support and encouragement for this move. And I think that will have an impact on the relationships between Muslim and Jewish community in both countries, but also globally, and all the other communities that reside in the UAE and have made the UAE their home. So there's a lot of expectation, and therefore there's a lot for all of us to deliver. And I hope we can work with partners and friends like you to deliver on that promise.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Thank you, Rabbi. This was a phenomenal discussion. I know we could go on for another few hours, and we've covered a lot of ground in the past hour plus. And so I thank you both for joining, and I thank all of our audience for tuning in live. Zoom can always be tricky, but thankfully we pulled it off. And to that end, would be remiss if I didn't thank the staff at the ambassador's office at the United Nations and the UAE Embassy in Washington, as well as the teams, Jewish Insiders team, I'm Saban's team, and our excellent producer, Scott Immergut. So with that, we'll end right there, and hopefully we'll have the chance to do more of these events in person. And until then, again, it's our privilege at Jewish Insider to be able to host these conversations virtually. So until next time, thank you and take care.